آزادی بیان
言论自由
Free speech.
Khaled Fahmy, you've seen our 10 draft principles for global free expression. How do they strike you from your perspective in Egypt in the middle of an extraordinary expansion of free expression?
They strike me as being very relevant. I think what we need in Egypt is precisely a debate about principles like these, and a societal debate about how to go about answering some of the questions that they raise. Because we've had some free speech. I have to admit, it didn't start only with the bloggers and the internet. Egypt has had 7 years, maybe 8 years of a free press, a relatively free press, that played a big role in preparing the public for what we've seen since January. But the question about limits and the conflict of various principles, like the principle of free speech and then the principle of privacy and that of national security. I mean, how do we deal with these principles when they clash? That is when we haven't really had a discussion. We have many examples from which we can draw conclusions and principles, but we haven't had a sober, reflective discussion about these as principles. So I think this would be very helpful to have a discussion in Egypt about them.
Now, if you look down the list, they obviously deal with different areas like knowledge, yes, like violence, like religion, like national security. Which do you think are the ones that are most, so to speak, acute and sensitive in Egypt at the moment? I mean, many people would imagine it's religion, but perhaps it's rather the army in the area of national security.
I'd like to expand on that. That's personally what I personally believe. I think the danger to Egypt's evolution in general and the principle of free speech in particular comes mostly from the army and not from Islamists. Islamists, as far as we have been seeing, are willing to play along according to rules of the game, the rules of the democratic game. It will be rough. They're newcomers, but so are we. Everybody is a newcomer. But the army isn't really. And we've seen what the army is capable of doing and what it has managed to do over the past 11 months. So it is the army, not the Islamists, that we should be fearful of. But out of these 10 principles, I have to say it's the fourth one that I think is the most interesting and the most acutely needed in Egypt. It's the ability to speak openly and with civility about all kinds of human difference. And I say this because with the opening of the political sphere, it is the ability to deal with each other as partners in the same country that we are still struggling with. And I here speak about Islamists and secularists, not the army, but the realization that we're here for good. We have to learn how to deal with each other with civility, and we have to learn how to listen to each other. That, I think, is one basic talent or need or principle that we actually have not highlighted enough in Egypt, especially between these two factions. Many Islamists would prefer Egypt to be completely Islamic, and many secularists at the same time would also like to wish Islamists away. And that is the danger here.
If we focus on the fourth principle, which is a principle as much about social practice, cultural norms, as about the law, where do Egyptians turn for role models in speaking with civility about difference? Does one turn to certain periods of Egyptian or Islamic history? Where do people look?
I mean, Egyptians are civil with each other in general. Despite all the cleavages and the fault lines that have appeared in Egyptian society over the past year, Egyptian society is very much intact. We're not talking about an East European model or a Lebanese model or an Iraqi model where there are some serious fault lines in society.
Even with the violence between Muslims and Copts?
Well, yeah, whichever fault line you want to talk about, whether it is a religious one, a class one, a regional one, Egyptian society is much more homogeneous than, let's say, Iraqi society or Lebanese society. And even with regards Muslims and Christians, the clashes that we've witnessed over the past year, as serious as they are, they were contained quite easily. And when Egyptians talk to each other publicly, there is this degree of civility and humor. That's the other thing that Egyptians are famous for. And it's interesting, the amount of humor that this revolution has generated is remarkable. And it's an interesting humor that is not self-deprecating. Of course, like all humor, it's sarcastic, but there is no cynicism and there is no self-deprecating deprecation in it. Of course, sometimes there is no mutual respect in the jokes, especially between Islamists and secularists, but not between Christians and Muslims. The jokes that are at least in the public sphere. But to come back to your question, I don't think we have a role model as such in terms of a certain period to look back to in which people disagree fundamentally, but with civility and with respect. And I think we're learning how to do this as we go along.
Indeed, the recognition of the possibility and legitimacy of humor, as well as the practice of it, is an important part of living with difference. I just wanted to be clear. On our 10th principle, we must be free to challenge all limits to free expression justified on such grounds as national security, public order, and morality. So what that says is not there can be no limits, but we must be free to challenge them in principle, to have a debate about where the limits are. You're not there yet in Egypt, are you?
But we're getting there. It's interesting how much the principle of national security or the pretext of national security as an impediment to free speech has actually been challenged. Before the revolution, you could not only challenge the army, you could not even praise the army in public. You could not mention the army at all in public. And it's very interesting because it highlights the importance of the principle of free speech. They say this has been done on the blog sphere, but also in the national media, on TV, in the press. They've been asking the following very serious questions. They've been asking questions about the military budget. They've been asking questions about military readiness and combat readiness. They've been asking questions about national conscription. And they've been asking all of these serious questions in the name of national security. They were saying, for national security's sake, we need to subject the military institution to public scrutiny. Interestingly, all the cases of corruption that have come to light, corruption during the Mubarak regime, came to light only recently, and people realized that it is precisely because of lack of scrutiny that corruption was so festering beneath the surface. So now people are saying, and I've heard this a couple of times, we need to ask the same kind of questions about the military. So it is fascinating. And of course, there is resistance. And every now and then people come and say, no, the army is a red line. You cannot cross it. It's the only intact institution that we have. And all the arguments that I'm sure you're familiar with. But it is remarkable how many red lines we have crossed since January regarding the army and national security.
One of our advisors, Sandra Colliver, is arguing for an 11th principle, the missing principle, which is an explicit right of access to information about public authorities. She believes that is such an important area of freedom of expression that it deserves a basic principle of its own. Does that, in some sense, tally with your experience, for example, when working in the archives on sensitive issues?
Very much so. Very much so. And I would very much like to have this 11th principle. It is a serious impediment to historical research in Egypt and indeed in the Arab world, and not only historical research, but I think without having access to state documents, without a Freedom of Information Act kind of legislation that gives citizens the right to information that have been produced by the government. The moment they are produced, of course, we know there are certain limits. Let it be 30 years, let it be 40 years, we can discuss this. But we cannot expect citizens to be active as in a democracy without giving these citizens the right to know what their governments are doing. In other words, without allowing them to exercise their right to oversee what the government is doing. So, especially with regards to all of these abuses that went with impunity over many, many years, the only way we can stop this is to have a principle enshrined in law or even in the constitution that basically says that the government, the only way it can act in a transparent way is to allow citizens access to information produced by that government. And that will go a long, long way. And I, as someone who has been on a committee to introduce a new archives law, I can tell you that this is a very difficult principle. They know, those in power know very much how important it is to hold on to their secrecy